Hello, and welcome to the Coy Pharmer, where we focus on cultivating clarity in the complicated world of pharmacy benefits. I'm Justine. I'm a pharmacist with 20 years of experience in the business of pharmacy, and today we're going to be breaking down MAC, or Maximum Allowable Cost. Let's dive in.
You're looking for the cure, but you're stuck in the weeds, bringing you insights into pharmacy.
Starting with the basics of MAC, we're going to start by breaking down the acronym. We're going to talk a little bit about why MAC exists in the first place. In practice, we'll talk about how MAC helps payers to control costs and how MAC can create some challenges for pharmacies. We'll start dipping our toe into the PBM Balancing Act and how the PBMs are trying to maintain P&L consistency across the payers and pharmacies, which creates a lot of difficult sprawl to manage. Then, as we go into the fine print, we'll go through some examples of exactly how MAC lists are rolled out and maintained within PBMs, and some take-homes for employers and resellers in the industry. So let's start with the basics. What does MAC stand for? MAC stands for Maximum Allowable Cost. The MAC price is the price that the PBMs are reimbursing the pharmacies for generic products. MAC is fundamentally derived as a mechanism for PBMs to attempt to align incentives for pharmacies to purchase the most affordable product and to avoid incenting them to purchase the products with the highest AWP. And we'll talk a little bit about why that matters as we start to talk about MAC in practice. We've dipped our toes into the idea of MAC, but let's talk about how MAC really flows through and impacts reimbursements throughout the industry. On this slide, we have on the left representative AWP for a brand drug with a single manufacturer. On the right side, we have multiple manufacturers of generic drugs. And in this case, because the manufacturers are setting the AWP, the manufacturers of generic drugs may set different AWPs from one another. So this creates somewhat of an imbalance or difficulty when PBMs are attempting to negotiate for drugs, as typically in brands, the basis is AWP, and in generics, they need to find another mechanism to be able to align incentives with the pharmacies. So in the case of a brand product, again, PBMs will typically reimburse the pharmacies at a rate that's AWP minus somewhere between 18 and 21%. And this is a relatively static and stable reimbursement rate across many of their pharmacy contracts. Now let's look at the generic side of the equation. If the PBM were to create an agreement with the pharmacies that they would reimburse generic products at, for example, AWP minus 89%, that would mean that the pharmacies may be incented and may get paid more for purchasing products that have a higher AWP. This can create an uneven experience for members if, for example, a member switched from a drug made by manufacturer 1 to a drug made by manufacturer 2. This could create increase in copayment that could be very difficult for members to understand. So instead of relying on AWP to drive reimbursement at the pharmacy level, PBM set up operational lists called MAC, Maximum Allowable Cost. This means that the PBM, no matter which manufacturer of a particular drug is filled at the pharmacy, the PBM will reimburse that pharmacy a flat amount, and that amount will be the MAC. There are some overarching contracts, and we'll talk about some of these examples later, where again, fundamentally, there are some generic effective rates flowing through the pharmacy experience. In that way, the AWP is still playing into some of the macroeconomics and dynamics that PBMs and pharmacies work with one another on. So to break this down in the most practical sense, the pharmacy will send the PBM a claim. Typically, that claim will go through at their usual and customary price. In this example, I've offered that the usual and customary may be $45 for this particular fill. The PBM will look at that price, and as long as the MAC is lower than that usual and customary price, they will reimburse the pharmacy at the MAC price. So no matter what the pharmacy has billed the PBM, they will return the MAC price as the actual reimbursement for that particular claim. There has been a lot of lobbying and efforts over the years for pharmacies to work against the practice of MAC. Why is that, and what is the chief complaint? So if you look at MAC today for a particular drug, that doesn't necessarily equal the MAC tomorrow or the MAC next week. The MACs can change and are unilaterally determined by the PBMs and can change over time and can maybe even change for certain members but not for others, or for certain networks but not for others. This creates an issue for the pharmacies in understanding and being able to predict and forecast what they will be able to make in generic margin. It is worth mentioning, because there are some tricky dynamics to MAC, in most states and most PBMs have methods to be able to appeal a particular reimbursement price. So if a pharmacy feels that they have filled a product for MAC, but they were not able to purchase the product at a price that is equal to or less than MAC, they may submit an appeal to the PBM in order to be able to gain a more favorable reimbursement. And sometimes that can impact the global MAC list if there's been a mistake or there's been a drug that's quickly inflated due to shortage or other issues. Because of the way the PBMs are structured, I often find that folks either have a good understanding of how the network reconciliations work with the pharmacies or how the plan sponsor reconciliations work, but not necessarily both. Something that I find most interesting is how the PBMs balance the pharmacy obligations and the plan sponsor obligations. And I'm going to walk through a couple of examples to talk about how this plays out in real life. So if we start first by looking at the PBM's obligations to plan sponsors, the PBM in this case has guaranteed the plan sponsor that their network discounts will be no less favorable than AWP minus 89%. It is possible that the PBM may underperform in this case. This example is they have reimbursed the pharmacies AWP minus 88%. When this happens, at the end of the year, there's a reconciliation that gets triggered with the PBM where the PBM needs to write the plan sponsor a check to make up for the difference of what the plan sponsor may have overpaid for drugs throughout the year in the generic claims. In another example, the PBM may also overperform. And in the case of overperformance, a lot of PBM contracts with plan sponsors give the overperformance to the plan sponsor. So, in other words, the check that the PBM wrote to the plan sponsor in the first example would not be reciprocal in nature. So, the PBM guarantees to the plan sponsors are typically a minimum level. That means that the PBM is guaranteeing in this case that the plan sponsor will reimburse pharmacies for generic drugs no less favorable than AWP minus 89%. However, any overperformance generally can accrue to the plan sponsor as they're being billed less for claims throughout the year. And there's not typically a mechanism where the PBM at the end of the year would be able to request a check from the plan sponsor to offset any overperformance in the network. So when this happens, the plan sponsor accrues that value of the lower generic cost, and that can make it more difficult for the PBM to meet their PBM pharmacy contract guarantees. I often find the PBMs are managing often to an effective rate with several pharmacies. This is not always the case, but can often be the case, especially with the large pharmacies who have a little bit more negotiation power with the PBMs. So in this case, the PBM and the pharmacy have agreed that reimbursement for generic drugs will be at least as favorable as AWP minus 90% to the pharmacy. In this example, the aggregate pharmacy reimbursement is AWP minus 91%, which means that the pharmacies were paid less than they were contractually guaranteed. Similar to the plan sponsor contracts, typically this underperformance would result in the PBMs having to write the pharmacy a check at the end of the year. In the case where the PBM over reimburses the pharmacies, so for example, they reimburse AWP minus 88% on average instead of the guaranteed AWP minus 90%, in those cases, the pharmacy can often accrue the value of the higher claims reimbursement. And in some contracts, the PBM is not able to recoup that cost. In this case, this makes it more difficult for the PBM to meet the obligation to the plan sponsors because the plan sponsors have now reimbursed the pharmacies too much money, which is difficult to claw back. Now that we walk through some of the basics of MAC and how it really creates dollar flow through the industry, we're going to get a little bit creative and talk about MAC List Sprawl. Personally, I was really surprised when I learned a little bit more about how the MAC lists operate within PBMs. And I think it's a very interesting concept worth visiting for those that haven't been intimately involved in reconciliation of these contracts. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about some take-homes for employers around MAC pricing, and then also some take-homes for those that are resellers around MAC pricing and how they might think about MAC and MAC management when they're selecting a PBM vendor. Okay, so we're going back again to our example where the PBM has a contract with pharmacies to reimburse generic drugs at AWP minus 90% on average. What a lot of folks that are not familiar with MAC management might think is that this means that the PBM has a MAC list that has many products on it, and they work to try to average those products out throughout all the pharmacies to AWP minus 90%. In reality, however, the PBMs have different contracts and may have different points of guarantees with several different pharmacies. So in this example, MAC A may be applied to pharmacy A and B, who maybe have a guarantee of AWP minus 90. MAC B may need to be applied to pharmacy C, who may have a guarantee of AWP minus 91, and so on and so forth. There's a similar phenomenon that happens on the plan sponsor side of the contract. So again, in this example, generic drugs are guaranteed on average at AWP minus 88%. This might lead folks to think that there is a MAC list that is designed to gear towards AWP minus 88% that most of the plan sponsors within a PBM are utilizing. But similar to the pharmacies, that is not the case. There are many MAC lists often required to manage plan sponsors who have different guarantee levels in their contracts, and also to manage plan sponsor margin targets for PBMs and resellers. When you really get into the nitty-gritty of network management, something that's really interesting to me is how these different concepts come together to create what I call MAC list sprawl. So for example, the PBM may have plan sponsors in cohort 1, which may be a cohort where they're trying to provide leading rates to be able to win new business, and those are some of the best rates that they have. Then they're managing which pharmacies may have different guarantees on the pharmacy side, and those may be managed differently with the large chains, the regional chains, and the independent pharmacies having different generic effective rate targets. Similarly, a PBM or a health plan may have a second cohort of plan sponsors who may be mid-contract or maybe have slightly less aggressive guarantees. Again, this leads to a new set of MAC lists that align to the different pharmacy types. And finally, we have the last cohort of plan sponsors, and often I see that health plans and PBMs may have between 5 and 8 standard cohorts, and again, very custom pricing for select larger clients that could lead to many cohorts more than are pictured on this screen. So as we bring it all together, again, on the left side, we have cohort 1, which has the most favorable pricing for the plan sponsors. On the right side, the large pharmacies often get the most favorable pricing from a pharmacy perspective. Because the PBM is trying to manage so many complicated dynamics, this leads to many different MAC lists being deployed and a lot of adjustments to each MAC list being required each day or each week. In my personal opinion, this is an area where AI could really come into the pharmacy benefits industry and create a more nuanced mathematical link in helping the PBMs balance all of these different obligations. And then lastly, in this example, plan sponsors' current performance is outperforming their guarantee. And so in some cases, a plan sponsor may be migrated to a new cohort or a new MAC list to be able to prevent overperformance for their contract. So what are some take-homes for employers related to MAC? In cases where a PBM offers both traditional and pass-through network contracts at the plan sponsor election, the PBM has a lot of flexibility to be able to exactly meet the plan sponsor's guarantees and avoid overperformance on any particular contract. This can make overperformance on generic pricing less likely. There are some PBMs that have a different business model, and their contracts are typically structured on a NADAC basis, or they have all of their contracts set up on a pass-through basis. This leads to overperformance accruing directly to the plan sponsors rather than accruing to the PBM or to other plan sponsors that may need tweaking. PBMs with this structure in their core business often can have overperformance on generic pricing. Working with a pharmacy consultant who's familiar with these different pricing methodologies and the different PBMs business models can help to project whether or not there may be overperformance on a particular contract. In the past, I've run a couple of procurements for commercial resellers. These are players in the channel that sell to self-insured groups where they may hold the contract or have some risk in terms of network management or how the PBM manages the network. So, for example, commercial health plans may have an ASO block of business. PBMs may run a network lease from another PBM. And this is also common in third-party administrators where they may potentially take some network risk when they're not technically managing the MAC list themselves. There are some advantages for these players in partnering with some of the larger PBMs that have some more sophisticated tools around MAC management to be able to gain tighter control over their revenue and risk. They can gain stronger forecasting abilities for FP&A purposes, asking a lot of questions about monthly reporting, even weekly reporting, so that they can understand where they stand against any downstream guarantees that they have. And then finally, some PBMs have better reporting than others on performance for downstream clients and for auditing firms. Thanks for sticking with us to learn a little bit more about the concept of MAC. We talked a little bit about the basics of MAC, how MAC impacts dollars flowing through the industry, and how complicated the PBM Balancing Act of managing obligations to plan sponsors and pharmacies can be. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this content helpful, please go ahead and like and subscribe. If you work at an organization in the industry that could benefit from additional training on topics like MAC, please reach out on our website for additional training or consulting services. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll see you next time.